Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute's Climate and Water Program. And welcome to the third of our series on panel discussions regarding key findings from polling data on the views of ordinary citizens from across the Middle East and North Africa. The series is done in partnership with our Barometer, which is the longest standing and largest repository of publicly available data on these views. Today's discussion will focus on attitudes towards the environment and climate change. The first of these panel discussions that we had in this series featured a presentation on attitudes towards the US, China, and Russia, as well as major regional actors such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. And the second panel discussion focused on food insecurity across the Middle East and North Africa region. The upcoming final and fourth panel will present our Barometer findings on regional attitudes towards and regarding gender. So in terms of format today, we'll start with a presentation from our Barometer on the key findings for today's topic before we dive into a discussion on the topic itself and the results that are going to be shared with our discussion panel today. So let me start by introducing our presenter from our Barometer, Mohammed Aboufegla. Mohammed is a research data specialist at Arab Barometer and is responsible for assisting the Arab Barometer team with data validation, data visualizations, and statistical analysis of the survey data. He's previously worked also on Syrian-Palestinian refugee issues in the Middle East and Europe. And after that presentation, we'll go into our discussion. And so we also have two additional panelists for our post-presentation discussion. We have Malak Al-Taib, which is an independent consultant, writer, and researcher that's based in Paris, France. She's currently working as an information analyst with Storyz in Paris, where she conducts analysis of the digital ecosystem with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa region. She also happens to be a non-resident scholar in MEI's Climate and Water Program. And then we also have Alicia Douth, which is an associate environmental consultant at AESG. She comes with an international set of environmental credentials and work experience throughout the US, Africa, and the Middle East, where she's provided clients with environmental consultancy and water quality monitoring services. So that very short and brief introduction, because I know we have a lot to learn and discuss, I'll hand it off to Mohammed to lead us with the findings presentation from our Barometer.
Thank you, Mohammed, and welcome to my fellow panelists. So to start, I'm just going to give a quick idea of what our Barometer is. We're a research network based at Princeton University. Our mission is to conduct public opinion surveys of the Middle East and North Africa. We provide insights into what ordinary citizens think in regards to various political, economic, and social issues. And we are the longest standing and largest repository of publicly available data on the views of citizens across MENA. About the project, to date, we have conducted more than 125,000 personal interviews in over 15 countries since 2006. We've done 87 national representative surveys, and based on the data that we get, we are able to see inter-country and intra-country comparisons over time, and we can also see trends, so like how views have changed over time. Our data is open source and available for analysis on our website, and we have a lot of commentary, so country reports, topical reports that anyone interested could find on our website. So these results that we're going to discuss today come from our Barometer's 7th wave. We've conducted this wave between October 2021 and July 2022 in 12 countries. So we have 12 nationally representative surveys of adult citizens, and we included more than 26,000 personal interviews with people from the different countries and their own places of residence. We fielded these surveys through local partners, and we have quite a long questionnaire. We included topics from COVID-19 to the economy, government performance, government trust, gender norms, international relations, and environment, among other topics. I would just note here that our data is now from this survey is now up on our website, and anyone can access it and conduct further analysis as they wish. To talk about the environment, what we've seen from our Barometer 7th wave is that the perception is that water is the biggest perceived environmental challenge facing countries across MENA. And only waste management comes second, but is not as high as water across countries. We've also found that citizens hold each other and hold their governments accountable and responsible for action on climate change. And there's also broad support among citizens for more governmental involvement in addressing climate change. However, despite recognizing these environmental challenges that the countries face, there are more immediate, more pressing challenges that take priority in people's minds. Also, we've seen that generally a lot of citizens do recycle, although they call it something else. But the motive behind these recycling habits is not as much environmental protection as it is just economics, or cost saving and convenience. To start with the perceived challenges, as I said, water is the biggest issue in most of these countries. We have around 60% in Tunisia, half or more in a lot of other countries like Algeria, Iraq, for example, and Libya. The majority of these numbers say that water is the biggest challenge that they face in their country. And again, this is the perception of the challenge. Reality, and an expert might dispute that, but this is what people think their country is facing in terms of environmental challenges. Other challenges are less important for people as they see them, including air quality, contamination, inefficient use of energy, and etc. Water here includes three different issues. So the first one is pollution of drinking water, pollution of waterways, and lack of water resources. And we've seen that among people who say that water is the biggest issue in their country, there's quite the big difference in what specific water-related issues they face. For example, in Egypt, we have the vast majority of people say that pollution of drinking water is the biggest problem. We have around 3/4 who say the same in Iraq. And this is, again, among people who say that water poses the biggest environmental challenge in their country. We've seen also around 2/3 in Tunisia, 63%, around more than half in Sudan, and then around half in Jordan and in Lebanon. On the other hand, pollution of waterways, so pollution of the sea, of rivers, we've seen it big in Kuwait. Around 3/4 of those who think water is the biggest challenge in Kuwait think that the main issue or the main challenge is pollution of waterways. There's also a big percentage in Libya, around 44%, who say the same thing. But again, these are like the main countries that face pollution of waterways as kind of like a major challenge for them. And then there's the lack of water resources, and we see it in countries like Mauritania, where 61% say that lack of water resources is the main challenge that their country face. Around half in Jordan say the same, and around 42% in Algeria also share this view, and 40% in Morocco. Again, this is among people who say water is the biggest challenge. So there is a lot of variation across countries. Each country have its own kind of specific water-related problems. We look at water by settlement, so where people live, and we've seen that it's not really uniform across the region. So in some countries, There are some, the urban population, for example, in a few countries, say that water is a bigger issue than the rural counterparts would do. We see that in Lebanon, we see it in Libya, and we see it also in Palestine. And from what we know is that, for example, in Lebanon, there's a big problem of water, especially in the major urban centers. Even within a city like Beirut, there's some difference in water supply and whatnot. And in Libya, it's also kind of similar problems, given the man-made river and how it originates from rural areas to the urban centers. And then, following 2011, there's a sense of weaponization of water supply in the country. So all these problems affect why or the urbanites feel or see water as a bigger issue than their rural counterparts. The flip of that coin is that in other countries, like in Egypt, for example, and Mauritania, people in rural areas think that water is a bigger problem than their urban compatriots. In Egypt, for example, a recent study found that around 7.3 million people have no access to safe waters, and the majority of these people live in rural areas. So basically, what we've seen from the results is that there are some variations, but again, the trend is not really uniform across the region. We also look at water as a problem in terms of environment, but also how it relates to lack of access to water. And we've seen that in almost all countries, people who experience repeated outage of water, so people who experience at least once a month, water cuts, think that water is a bigger problem than those who have kind of a secure access to water would do. We see the biggest gaps in Palestine, around 17-point gap between the two groups. In Egypt, there's around 12-point gap. In Morocco, in Mauritania, also there's 12-point gap between those who have experienced, often water outages compared to those who have secure access to water. Again, the second main environmental challenge facing many countries is waste management. We see that around 30% in Sudan, a little bit less in Palestine and Libya, say that waste management is the biggest problem. And we ask people about their level of satisfaction in regards to government service in trash collection. And we see that in all countries that we survey, those who are dissatisfied with the trash collection services tend to view waste management as a bigger problem or bigger environmental challenge than those who are satisfied with the service. And we see there's a huge gap in Sudan, for example. There's a 16-point gap. The same 16-point gap also exists in Egypt. So there is this sense of concern in regards to waste management, and again that includes trash collection and industrial waste. So in a sense, it's not really just exclusive to trash collection. It goes beyond that in terms of what happens to trash afterwards. Is it really recycled properly or not? Is it just dumped in certain areas that might cause problems in the future? We see this in a lot of countries. There's a huge gap in most of these countries between the two groups, those who are satisfied with the services and those who are dissatisfied. When it comes to who's responsible for these environmental challenges, we see that the majorities in all countries hold each other, so hold citizens and hold the government responsible for contributing to environmental challenges. We see around 88% in Kuwait say that both lack of citizen awareness and lack of government initiatives affect or contribute to environmental challenge. But what we see here is there's some tendency in some countries to kind of blame citizens more than governments for contributing to climate change, and this is especially true in Iraq, where there's a 17-point gap between blaming government and blaming citizens. There's also a huge gap in Egypt, 12 points, in Tunisia, 12 points also, and in Palestine, where we see a 10-point gap. Again, people hold each other and hold the government accountable, but there's a tendency to holding or to blaming lack of citizen awareness more than lack of government initiatives. And we see in some governments in some countries try to act and to address climate change, and we can talk about that later. We look at lack of environmental awareness among citizens by education and income. We see that in some countries, education tend to differentiate between people who say that or who cite this issue or this factor as a major factor contributing to climate change or to environmental challenges. We see that in Sudan, for example, people, those who have higher education, tend to believe that lack of environmental awareness among citizens, is a bigger problem than those with lower levels of education. On the other hand, income differentiates people in other countries like Kuwait, for example, and in Mauritania, where there's a 12-point gap between the two groups. Those who have high income and those who have lower incomes. We also look at this by age. We often think of environment as a youth story. So we see that youth in a lot of these countries that we included in the survey tend to kind of be more willing to blame citizens or blame lack of environmental awareness among citizens for contributing to environmental challenges. We see some differences between youth ages 18 to 29 compared to their older compatriots. But what we've noticed here in a lot of these countries is that there isn't really a big difference between those who are 18 to 59. But the difference happens in the oldest generation, so those who are 60 or older, who in many cases tend to be less likely to blame lack of environmental awareness among citizens for contributing to this challenge. For example, we see that in Mauritania, only 50% of those 60 or older say that lack of environmental awareness is a factor contributing to environmental challenge. Compared to that, we see 67% of youth ages 18 to 29 saying the same. So again, there's a difference between those who are kind of in the oldest generation, so 60 years old or older, compared to their younger compatriots. We look at also lack of government initiative or like government spending, and we see people with higher education in a lot of these countries tend to blame the government more. This is especially true in Lebanon, for example, where there's a 9-point gap. There's also a 9-point gap in Egypt and in Tunisia, and we see an 8-point gap between those who have higher education and those who have lower education in Kuwait as well. Income doesn't differentiate as much as education in this regard, but we noticed the case of Sudan here, where there's a 16-point gap between those who are kind of well off, so have a bit of higher incomes compared to others who have lower incomes. And basically, the well off tend to blame government spending or lack of government spending more as contributing to environmental challenges. We asked a question about whether citizens want their governments to be involved more or do more in addressing climate change. And we see pluralities in most countries that we included in the survey say that they want their governments to do more. This is especially true in two North African countries, in Tunisia and Algeria. 64% in Tunisia say they want their government to do more. 62% in Tunisia say they want their government to do more. And even in the lowest percentages in Jordan, for example, 39% of the population say they want their government to do more. 40% in Morocco. And what's notable about both Morocco and Jordan is that these two countries, or the governments of these two countries, are already announcing or already have plans in place for addressing climate change. And even like although these are less than half, but it's not really a reflective of people. Basically, people are not saying that they want their governments to do less, but in some countries, maybe they want the governments to maintain the same level of engagement as it has previously. And again, in Jordan, for example, we see that 39% want the government to do more, 39% say they want the government to do the same. And this might be in recognition of some government efforts to address climate change. We look at this tendency or support for more government action in addressing climate change by electricity and water outages. We see that in some countries, those who experience electricity outages often, like in Lebanon and Sudan and Iraq, they tend to want more government involvement or more government action in addressing climate change. In Lebanon, there's an 18-point gap. There's a 12-point gap in Sudan between those who experience electricity outages at least once a month, compared to those who have secure access to electricity. However, we don't really see as much difference as we would expect in terms of water outages. Only in Lebanon, there's a 6-point difference between those who have insecure access to water compared to those who have rarely or never experienced water outages. In terms of income seems to differentiate people more. We see people who are well off generally want more government action compared to those who have lower incomes. And this is especially true in Morocco. There's a massive gap between the two economic groups, between the two classes. In Morocco, around 32% points, or 32 points between those who have higher income and wanting more government action compared to those with lower incomes. There's also a significant gap in Egypt and Mauritania, around 11 or 12 points, 10 points in Sudan and Lebanon. So there's quite the difference between economic groups in wanting more government action when it comes to climate. The same is true for settlements. So comparing urbanites to rural populations, in a lot of these countries that we survey, urbanites want more government action in addressing climate change. We see 11-point gap in Morocco and Sudan, 10-point gap in Lebanon, and around 9-point gap in Egypt. So we see differences both by income and by settlement, or by where people live, basically. Despite that, as I said, a lot of people, many citizens want more government action. However, climate change or environmental protection is not really as priority as other more pressing, more immediate issues. We ask citizens what they think the top government spending priority should be, and environmental protection usually is ranked lowest among other factors, or among other issues. But I think it's noteworthy here to note that the other issues that we include in this question is our subsidies, spending on education, spending on healthcare, spending on transportation, and spending on national security. So for a lot of citizens, these are more immediate, more pressing day-to-day issues that they see and witness and experience on a daily basis. The story is the same for preferences for foreign aid. Also, environmental protection ranks lowest. And this is compared to spending on economic development, on education, on civil society, on healthcare, and basically improvement of infrastructure. Also, for priorities for United Nations, again, climate change ranks lowest, and this is among other issues that include unemployment, infrastructure, economic development, and spending on education or basic services, basically. So again, what we see from these questions is that although people recognize environmental challenges, although they want more government action in climate change and addressing climate change, there are more immediate issues that take priority to the environment, basically. We ask people whether they engage in some recycling habits, basically reusing plastic or glass bottles to store water, for example. And we see that in a lot of countries, majorities say they often or sometimes do that. This is especially true in Palestine, where 3/4 of the population say so. 2/3 in Egypt, around 60% in Tunisia, and more than half in Morocco. Around half also say the same in Jordan and Algeria, and then there's between 40% and a quarter say the same in all other countries. What we see, though, is that people who have lower incomes tend to be the ones who engage in this behavior more. So in all the countries that we survey, or most of them at least, we see a difference between those who have lower income and those who have higher incomes. For example, in Jordan, there's a 14-point difference between the two groups. Those who have lower incomes tend to reuse plastic or glass bottles more than those who have higher incomes. And that, in a sense, explains the motive, or reflects the motive behind this behavior. What we see is that majorities in some countries engage in this behavior in order to save money and for cost saving purposes, basically. This is true for 70% of people who say that they reuse plastic bottles. 70% of them in Lebanon say they do that to save money. 56% and 55% in Palestine and Iraq say they also do it to save money, basically. What we see is that environmental protection is not really the main motive, except maybe in Kuwait, where around half say they do that or they reuse plastic bottles to protect the environment. Around a quarter in Libya and Sudan also say that they reuse plastic bottles to protect the environment, but in all other countries it's a factor less. But I think the point here is that people already have this recycling mentality, recycling in other names, basically, and it could be useful perhaps to use this kind of already existing behavior to raise more awareness in regards to its importance in terms of environmental protection. I think I'll give it back to you, Mohammed.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. There's a lot to dissect here. There's a lot of information, and hopefully we'll get into that. Before we dive into discussion, just a couple of things. Maybe a clarifying question, Hamad, on the selection of the countries that were part of the inventory. I think a Q&A came in just to clarify that before we kind of go into the details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we do is basically there are several reasons. We would like to include as many countries as we can, but there are some restrictions by certain governments or certain countries on surveys. There's also financial and logistical restraints So this is what stops us from basically doing surveys in other countries. We try to include as many countries as we can, but the reality sometimes stops us from actually doing these surveys in certain countries.
Excellent, great. Okay, I was gonna say audience can submit Q&A questions, but they already have started to without my instructions. So we'll pepper those in as we go along. But really, the first question I kind of want to ask, and really I want to get your first reactions. Just on there's some interesting findings and outcomes and combination of things I didn't think would necessarily be intuitive. So Mohammed, let me start with you, and then we'll go around the panel, which is, you as someone who's sort of compiled this data, looked at the raw data and put it together. Out of these results, what is your reaction in the sense of what surprised you and what was maybe more in line with your expectation? Something you saw and said, yeah, this makes sense, and other things like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't expect those reactions to be this way. What jumped at you?
I think for in terms of things that didn't really surprise me as much is the first thing, which is the water is the biggest problem in a lot of these countries. I think that was from my own personal experience, that was expected. And also that there are other issues that take priority. So these are the main things that kind of when I saw them, I was like, yeah, that makes sense, because we know that a lot of our across the region there is this water issues in a lot of the countries. And there are also a lot of economic problems, food insecurity and other issues that people kind of tend to focus more than other issues like the environment, basically. What surprised me a little bit is that there's a broad support for more government action. Again, because there are other issues that take priority, I didn't expect their citizens to be supportive of more government involvement in addressing climate change. But that's something I would say perhaps promising, that there is this sort of awareness that this is an issue that we need to take care of at some point. If not today, because we have other issues, but we still need to work on it at some point.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Alicia, let me turn to you and ask you the same question from Mohammed's presentation. What jumped at you? What reaffirmed maybe a suspicion or just sort of a conventional belief that how people would respond to these type of questions, and then what jumped at you as kind of unexpected? Oh, I think you're on. We can't hear you for some reason. Yeah, no. Is everyone else having same issue? Can you hear Alicia, or is it just me? No? Okay, why don't we do this, Alicia? I'll switch to Malak for the question, hopefully give you some time to hopefully address the issue. All right, Malak, same question. What jumped at you? What was surprising? And then what was maybe not so surprising? Just kind of reconfirming what you would think.
What was surprising, I guess, the lack of citizen awareness by age. I mean, there isn't much difference, from 18 to 29 and plus 30 in different countries around the region, especially when it comes to lack of environmental awareness among citizens. But wasn't surprising, and I was happy to see was seeing like water challenges as the main issue in most of the Arab countries. But what was surprising was linked to the water outage. So for some countries, that was quite interesting to me to see a high rate of water outage. in the region. But it's good to see that there is more pushing for governmental government addressing like climate change and holding governments accountable, because usually there is this differentiation or gap between governments and citizens. So putting the government in the front row of handling these issues was not quite surprising, but it was good to see that citizens actually want the government to do more action.
Yeah, that was an interesting outcome, I thought, as well. Alicia, hopefully you're good.
It's working now.
We can hear you. Yes, excellent.
Yes,
Excellent. Okay.
thank you. Okay, great. So I absolutely, I mean, it was something that I anticipated to see, that water challenges in this environment was prone to be the biggest problem that they all addressed, which is good, because that means everybody recognizes it, that there is a problem. And however that problem affects them, they've addressed that that's a problem. And for me, that's a really good indicator that people are aware. Now it's just about linking how the cumulative impacts of all those different are related to climate change and the pollution, and, you know, to get people to understand that climate change will impact the water quality, you know, it'll impact the scarcity, all these different elements now, to just bring everything together. So I'm very happy, though, to see that, not happy, because obviously the situation is not great from what we've seen in the polls, but they've recognized it, which means it's prompted them to take hopefully more action, to be more aware, and to obviously now kind of hold the government a little bit more accountable, and to really prepare themselves for climate resilience. So I was very satisfied, thinking, okay, I'm glad to see that people have really shown their concern and given their thoughts on what they feel will be problems for them in the future.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway, I think, from a subset of those findings. Q&A questions are coming in fast and furious, and I promise audience will get to them. I'll pepper in maybe at the earlier end some more clarifying ones. I think that's helpful to set the discussion. One of the clarifying ones, Mohammed, was were these interviews conducted in person at respondents' household, or how was the survey administered and the data collected?
Yeah, we always conduct our surveys face-to-face in the person's place of residence, which we think might be a better place to, you know, kind of like a safer place for people to share their views. Perfect.
Okay. Let me dive into some of the questions I had, and we'll incorporate the Q&A from the audience as we go along where it fits. You kind of touched on it, Alicia. So and these questions, everyone is in the panels is free to answer, but I'll start at certain places, and others may choose to follow up. So the survey targeted some discussed or garnered responses on some specific environmental challenges. Are there others that are worthy of also inclusion, meaning that, and Mohammed, maybe this could also be a point of clarification, is that the environmental challenges discussed, was that a sort of a raw response, or were the participants given a selection of challenges? Let me clarify that, and then Elisa, I'll give you the more pointed question.
Yeah, no, this is a closed-end question. So we provide a list of the challenges, basically, but we always allow people to basically have their input if they think that there's another issue that is more pressing that we didn't include in the question.
Okay, great. So then, Elisa, I turn to you and I ask, we saw the list that Mohammed shared in terms of the, in the earlier part of the survey results in terms of the environmental challenges. Is there something missing? Is there potentially a gap? I mean, spoiler alert, the answer is probably yes, right? Is there a gap in terms of areas that are environmental challenges that either citizens are aware, but maybe didn't, isn't necessarily high in their priority list, or maybe there's a gap in awareness of potential environmental challenges that aren't necessarily in the public's purview?
No, that's a great question. So what I really believe is what jumps out at me, and I'm thinking from an environmental impact assessment frame of mind, because that's what I do as a consultant. But for me, it's biodiversity loss, and it's the habitat loss, and it's the fragmentation of the environment from urbanization. So I think that ecosystem is really encompasses how we need to connect everything. And it's easy for people to identify with a water problem or, you know, a waste problem, but also that whole biodiversity aspect is really what keeps the health of the whole ecosystem going. So I think, you know, that's an environmental challenge that's that we're facing and that needs to be addressed, because it ultimately has, you know, that residual impact through all the other elements that are concerned. So that would be my number one thing, is biodiversity loss, habitat loss.
Yeah, certainly. I imagine, you know, there's a lot of cascading effects from impacting that particular area. Malak Mohammed, do you want to chime in on this question as well, if you'd like? You don't have to, because we have plenty of questions, but if you want to, I just want to give you the space.
Yeah, I just want to add, I hope that there will be more points addressing land degradation and desertification. I mean, these are highly connected, and for a water scarce region, we're talking about the MENA region here, land degradation and desertification are increasing due to climate change. And this is directly linked to food security, and food security now is not only an issue for the region, but it's a global issue that many variables contribute to. But I was hoping to see more maybe points addressing land degradation, certification, and its linkage to food security, as these are connected again with water scarcity. So this is my take here.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I'm going to pull on that thread for the next question when it comes to water. Hamed, as someone who is involved with the data, you know, as you said, there was a preset of maybe options in terms of these questions that are related to environmental challenges. In retrospect, was there something that you would also have included, just sort of asking you the same question, but just a little bit differently, as an added option for respondents, potentially as an environmental challenge that wasn't in the original list?
Yeah, I think what Alicia and Malak said is important. And desertification, for example, is a big problem that a lot of countries face. But we started in our barometer. We started asking about the environment in the last wave, AB5, between 2018 and 2019. And then we developed a bigger battery of questions in this wave. And we're always looking to expand, to improve the questions that we have. So this is very useful.
Good. Okay. So let's shift similarly, but let's shift to water. And Malak, you're pulling on that thread. So I'll start with you. In terms of you know, assessing water issues, whether it was part of the respondent options or not, what are higher priority? And then you kind of you were starting to mention water scarcity. So in terms of that, water issues for the region, whether it's, you know, of the list of options that were included and people responded to, or otherwise, do you feel should be, you know, not saying we should tell people how to think, but should be a priority, you know, from a citizen perspective, in terms of, you know, importance? Obviously, different countries may have differences in terms of what they deem as a priority when it comes to water resource issues, but maybe in a sense of what they should be concerned with, maybe in a sense of awareness, maybe to understanding the issues more deeply. What would you say from a water resource perspective is should be priority?
Okay, from a water resource perspective, I think in our time now, given the water scarcity situation in the region and the availability, addressing water availability now is different from how we have been addressing the availability of water, whether through, for instance, groundwater aquifers, or using desalination, for instance, or any other alternative resource. But I think one of the water issues that we should consider as a priority for the region is now the availability, but also accessibility but also the sound use of water resources. It's not a question of how much water is available, but how can we address the groundwater aquifers, for instance? To what extent now we can use or have the right to use groundwater aquifers, and how can we change our behavior to implementing or even using alternative resources, which I know is not the case for the entire Arab region. But I think the usage of waters, especially like natural resources, is something that we need to address since the availability is not as high as it used to be years ago. So we need to see to what extent we can use those resources, but also, for instance, like the water outage in many regions in the country, and seeing Algeria as the highest to have water outage percentage. That was quite surprising. This means that people are not having, even though water is somewhat available, but they're still having outage of water. And this corresponds to the water, not only water availability, but corresponds to the water accessibility by citizens, and what alternative resources or even options they can have to have water. So I think water accessibility is something that we need to address more, or even think of more when we talk about water issues.
Yeah, not to distill everything you said, but my takeaway from that is it's an issue of supply and reliability, right? Alicia, I'll turn to you in the same question, and I suspect you may tell us more on water quality. Not to preempt your answer, but what do you think is a priority in that sense for water resources in the region?
It's like you could read my mind, but I would definitely.
I read your bio, so I just made an educated guess.
And I absolutely, I believe that, and that's why it's true, because I think, you know, quality can come in biological, physical, chemical forms. There's many different, you know, ways to describe water quality, and you know, some people are okay with maybe having, I don't know, chemical quality at exceedance, but they need that water, so they overlook the other parts of the quality that would essentially, you know, resources, that's the first thing, and then the quality secondary is what I think, because obviously it needs to be there, and then it's an afterthought of if the quality is good or not, because if you're in that situation with a scarce water environment, you're less likely to consider the water quality. You just want that natural resource. So I definitely agree that, you know, the water quality should always be a sticking point, because, you know, whether we desalinate water here, we still run the risk of having water quality issues, whether it's from distribution or infrastructure or lack of, or, you know, I think that the water quality is kind of encompasses a lot of the problems, along with scarcity and, you know, all the other very important things. But for me, I like to focus on the quality, because ultimately it has to be in a good quality, as a very general term of saying it, before we can use it for many different attributes that we'd like to, from agricultural, you know, from irrigation, from potable. So the quality for me is one of the key points that I always like to make sure get emphasized.
I'm glad to hear that. Hamad, do you have a perspective on this in terms of the water resource question and the respondents, and did we capture the range of priorities when it comes to water resources? Do you feel citizens capture or were able to understand, and I mean respondents, I should say, or is there something missing?
I think there are some issues that we can we capture the perceptions of, and you know, some of these issues could be looked at kind of objectively, and perhaps measured more objectively, but I think you know, again, like water remains the big issue. I think finding the water resources is the first step, but But then, and as we've seen in the results, there are quite the difference between differences among citizens or among across countries in what the water-related issue is. So, in some countries, it's pollution of drinking water. In some other countries, it's actually lack of resources. I think each country would have its own specific challenges. Water is kind of like an overall theme, but then there are specific challenges at the country level, and even at the intra-country level in some cases.
Great. Let me pepper in a clarifying question, and the Q&A is coming fast and furious, so maybe I'll start answering some of those, so the audience isn't mad at me. One of the questions, Muhammad, is on, let's see if I can find it again. I think it was on participation in the surveys or respondents, meaning, was there any stratification or distinguishing or differences in the type of respondents? I think the question was specifically alluding to differences between, are everyone responding to the survey considered nationals? Are some expats? Are some foreign workers, or that type of thing? Was there any stratification of that in terms of respondents?
So our surveys are national representatives, so they only include nationals of the country, and this is just the adult population, so citizens aged 18 or older.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start with some of the Q&A.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. We have the technical reports up on our website, and has more details on basically the methodology that we used, and the number of respondents in each country, and the dates and everything. So there are more details on the technical report that we have on our website in terms of the technical questions.
Great. And I think that was actually one of the questions, which was on availability of I was going to touch that on the end, but since you brought it up now, which is where the presentation's available on as our Barometer website, or I guess some of the respondents weren't able to find it, but someone actually answered. Our audience is interacting with each other. Someone actually responded this question where it's available, but it's on the website, right, Muhammad?
Yeah, and we also have a forthcoming report on climate that will be more extensive than the presentation, and we'll have it on the website in the upcoming weeks.
Perfect. All right. Since we're shifting to public Q&A, where the topics may be all over the place, so I apologize for that, but we just have so much to cover. So one of the earlier questions was really, given the region is one of the most vulnerable to climate change ramifications, and I think that is certainly the case. And this is on the public perception on the risk from climate change as reflected by the survey results. The person writing the questions found this to be surprising in terms of it being low, in terms of, do people understand the risk of climate change? And the question is, could it be that respondents aren't necessarily able to link that adverse impacts of climate change to climate change itself, thinking that it's unrelated, right? Or not even thinking about climate change as a driver to some of these issues. We're talking about water scarcity, environmental challenges, etc. Respondents seem to have listed more immediate or maybe less abstract issues, such as water issues, which, some of these things can certainly be driven by climate change. So I guess if I could distill that, the question I think is, did you get a sense, Mohammed, from the respondents that they understood that these impacts, certainly a large number of them, are driven by climate change, or did they view that as sort of separate?
So I think this is one of the questions that we would like to investigate further, which is, to what extent do people connect some of the issues that they face directly, and how much, or to what extent they connected to climate change. A few weeks ago, we had the food insecurity event, and we had the food insecurity report. And my colleague, Salma Shami, connects the issue of food insecurity to climate and, food scarcity and whatnot. So this is something that we are definitely looking into more. And we're hoping that, since our data is public, we could see some contributions from experts who know more about the climate than us, and see their work on basically investigating this question further.
Yeah. I'll pepper in one more and then go back to our original discussion. And I think this is connected to what you just said in a way, Mohammed, which is more of a technical question on the survey themselves. And our audience participant basically saying, why was the question, how serious do you think the following issues are? And I think the responses were climate change, air quality, water pollution, trash, from wave 5 removed in following waves. I'm assuming that's the series of surveys. The comment is that this question seemed to capture, citizens' perceptions of how serious climate change is, kind of connected to our previous question, as opposed to the current format where respondents need to look at climate change compared to other issues such as water resource issues. Was there a particular reasoning why there was a shift in the question, how the question's posed? I think you sort of answered it, but maybe just to underline.
Yeah. So one of the things that we saw from wave 5 is that when we ask people separately about each of these questions, what we see is that large number of people say, they're all important. And although this is useful, but it doesn't tell us as much as we would like to know in terms of what is the most pressing issue, what are the most important challenges that they face. So this is why we try to we changed this question, and we try to expand the battery more on the environment. And as I mentioned earlier, we're always looking to expand. We're always looking to improve our questions. But that's the main reason why we diverted from the original question from a few years ago.
Great, sounds good. Okay, let's go back to our sort of discussion topic. So we talked about the environmental challenges. We shifted to water resources. Let's talk about, I think, following that line of thought, waste management. Going into the sort of the topical themes that were part of the survey itself. How, in consideration of how people responded to the questions related to waste management, how the question is, and I'll start with you, Alicia, and then we can go around again, which is, how would you assess the state of waste management in the MENA region? Certainly the countries that are involved, particular countries involved in the survey, but even in a broader sense, and then considering the respondents' answers, is it a match in terms of, are we where we need to be in terms of waste management? I'm guessing not. But, in a sense, if you would grade it, where are we in the region, and do you feel that citizens are sort of, pulsed into the current state?
So to be honest, I really think that the waste management throughout the MENA region is so varied, and it's mostly because of the infrastructure built to deal with the waste, whether it's engineered or whether it's localized, and if the countries are coping with that produced waste and how they're handling it, and that value of waste has a different so the waste value has a different meaning for each country. So it's really hard to compare, I think, when I'm looking at Saudi Arabia, who is coming up, and their whole waste management is now forming and taking place under their Saudi Green Initiative. But here in the UAE, we know that they're really harnessing waste. They see the value of that waste, and it's something that they want to capitalize on to remove the waste from the environment, and then make sure that they're pushing things forward and creating that value for the waste. And then in other regions, that they can't cope with the waste, and that's mostly because they don't have the infrastructure to cope with it from a municipal point of view. So I think decentralizing the waste management in some of these other countries would really help them cope with their waste problems, because once they have a centralized system that can't manage, then the whole waste infrastructure falls apart. But if they were able to decentralize it, bring it to a localized level, I think that the communities could greatly benefit from the waste, because there is value in many waste streams, and I think that potential just needs to be looked at for each area in particular, and how they can better address their waste problems and on a local level.
Yeah, that's a great potential solution to move forward, or added solution to move forward. Malak, you're versed in this topic as well. Do you have any sort of commentary on that in terms of the state of waste management and areas of improvement?
Yeah, I mean, for the Middle East, when we talk about waste management, the issue mainly is surrounded, or let's say centered around, legislation and poor planning. Many countries, they lack the legislative framework, but also the regulations to deal with their waste. And I think it's one of the main issues. And we have, for example, we have the insufficient funds, we have the absence of strategic waste management plans. There's a lack of coordination among stakeholders, and we could see it, for instance, in Tunisia. In Tunisia, they have been struggling with waste management for a few years now, and it has caused even protests and riots by citizens in certain regions, which directly impacts the health of citizens. So I think it's more of looking towards how countries, as Alicia said, how they can deal efficiently with waste, but also to look into developing skills and also increasing efficiency in technical and also operational decision making. These can help highly in tackling waste management. But also, as Alicia also mentioned, the value of waste differs from one country to another. So when we talk about waste, we need to understand the local context and how the local context can help in managing the waste better for each country.
Yeah. Mohammed, you're free to answer this question, but I also want to move on to a different question that I want to target to you. So stop me if you want to respond to this question, but I think this other question is also interesting, which is, we're talking about the challenges and issues. Let's shift to awareness and response, right? Or talk more about awareness and response. I want to focus on the citizen aspect. So, again, from your perspective as someone who's involved in this process of collecting the data and analyzing it, and based on how the responses came through, what are ways, based on these responses, that we can increase citizen awareness of environmental challenges? And I know some of our other panelists kind of hinted at some of those things, but from your perspective, just sort of looking at how people responded and your intimacy with the data, what are some of the ways to improve that from a citizen level?
I think I saw a question on the Q&A that kind of relates to this, or at least my answer is related to that.
Okay,
which is a lot of what we ask about in terms of environmental challenges, as someone in the Q&A mentioned, they could again be objectively measured, which is very important, because what we hope that our data could be used for is that comparison between perceptions and objective measurement. So basically, we see in each of the countries that we include in the survey, how big is the waste management problem, water scarcity problem, and whatnot. And then after that, if there are any awareness gaps that could be identified, that would be fantastic, using our data and objective measures, because that's the first step in improving citizen awareness, or basically improving any action plan to mitigate environmental challenges. So I think this is perhaps the first step that I would say experts would need to make, which is comparing basically perceptions with objective measurements and reality of environmental challenges. Because without really understanding how if there are any differences between what people think and what people actually are, or what the problem actually is, without knowing the difference, it's hard to really move in the right direction.
Yeah. Alicia and Malak, do you want to add anything to that in terms of the citizen awareness of environmental challenges and how to bridge that gap? Or you don't have to if you don't want to, but just giving you space if you want to add something.
I did. I mean, I think it's important that those gaps are identified, and then those gaps should form into frameworks and strategies and initiatives on all levels. So, you know, in my eyes, just getting this information is enough to really see where the gaps are and how those perceptions can be better, I don't know, informed as well, because then it really gives, you know, government some clear insight onto what people are thinking. So I think the first step, like we said, is identifying those gaps, and then it should evolve and build upon that. So
yeah, you're pulling on a thread, and Malak, feel free to interrupt me if you want to answer this question before I move to this one. Just interrupt me whenever you like. You're pulled on the thread of government response, which is where I want to move next. And the thing there is, you know, there's a few things I want to dive into, but maybe the first thing to touch on is, from the government perspective, what are some specific government initiatives that each of you would advocate for to target some of these, you know, based on how people responded, some of these environmental challenges, and really all the challenges, whether it's environment, water, waste, etc., based on how people responded, what would you advocate for to be, you know, once again, recognizing, you know, resources are challenging, funding, etc., you know, different governments have different capabilities and capacities, but generally speaking, what's high on that list that government initiatives should consider? And maybe Malak, I'll ask you this first, since you didn't have a chance to chime in on the last question.
I think for this part, what governments should initiate more, given the responses that we have. I mean, all environmental issues are important, and we cannot say that one is more important than the other, because in one way or another, they are connected and they affect differently people's lives. But I would suggest, from the results that we had presented, governments should initiate more their programs and also their legislations and reforms focusing on water resources, and also like the water availability and how citizens can adapt to the availability of water that we have now in the region, because we're looking at water scarcity as something in the present now, and we're not addressing it as something in the future. So a few years from now, we need, and from now on, we need to adapt more on how we use water, but also it's not just water usage, but also water availability, and how people would have to change or would have to look for other resources. And as mentioned earlier in the beginning, that water is used as a threat in many countries, especially in conflict countries, areas in the MENA region. So government should address not only water availability, but what kind of water resource alternatives and water management and governance within the region should be initiated as a top priority by governments. And this is my take on this.
Great. Alicia, Mohammed, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. And I really think what should be tackled from a government perspective, which will encompass everything, what I think will encompass everything that's a concern, is really building upon climate resilience. And that being said, is once you build a strong climate resilience, you know, sort of infrastructure, I guess you could say, around whatever areas that you're looking to protect, I think only a positive impact will come from all of that. So if you're going to have mangrove plantings, reintroduce mangroves, you've got a natural purification, you're introducing those nature-based solutions, and everything else will follow suit in a very high level way. Everything else should, take its natural course and hopefully address all the other issues that are related to that. So for me, building that climate resilience really sets you up for being able to respond to all the issues that's, from a waste perspective, from a water quality, from a pollution of waterways, to erosion control. Everything is kind of centered around how we build, how we plan to address urbanization and move forward with, smarter, greener urban design, as well as incorporating those nature-based solutions into our design and building up that resilience for us to be able to, kind of be prepared for what's to come from the climate change that's happening, and water scarcity being one of them.
Yeah. Hamed, did you want to add to that, or do you want me to move us to the next question, which I think is going to fall on your purview?
I'm not really an expert on climate, so
okay. And I have the question for you.
Yeah.
No worries. We have a lot of questions. So I'm gonna shift to this, at least for now, as being sort of last of my main questions, and then we'll try to somewhat rapid fire the Q&A where it makes sense. But now we talked about the citizen response. We now just talked about the government response. I want to connect those two. One of the things that jumped at me in some of your results, Mohammed, which is, excuse me, it seems to be there's a disconnect between citizens that essentially want their governments to do more on climate change and governments that are not making, climate change or issues related to climate change or coming out of climate change, of which, all the things we talked about, they're not making it a priority. So I just find that very interesting, and I'm trying to understand how that how that gap can be bridged, right? Because, we've talked about, making things priority, government initiatives, communication, that type of thing. But from your sense, realistically, constructively, how can that gap be bridged between the citizen perspective and then the government priorities?
I think, in a sense, I guess issues have to be reframed in a more connected way. Because if you continue to think of the environment or climate change as something that is completely unrelated to other issues like outage of electricity, outage of water, food scarcity, and all that, if you continue to think of them as two separate issues, then there are, of course, the more immediate issue is going to take priority all the time. And with these more pressing issues, it's really hard to ask someone, ask a citizen, or expect someone to think of something that is seems a bit more in the far away from them, which is climate change. So I think the first I would say the first step is really to reframe the issues in a more connected way, to basically connect the dots between all these problems that people are facing on a daily basis with the bigger problem, which is the environment, basically.
Yeah. Malak, Alicia, do you have any perspective on this? I know it's a big, broad question. We're not going to have the solutions today, but at least, ways to think about how to bridge that gap between sort of the citizen perspective. And I think it's a larger question beyond the issues we talk about, the environment and water and climate, but how do you bridge that? How do you get over that disconnect?
I mean, I think it's pretty general to say, but what comes to mind, if I were just to give you an answer right now, would be to synthesize that, just the government needs to create that that market and that value for the citizens, and give them those incentives to take part, and to let them be part of the situation and part of the solution, because I think essentially everybody has to come together to bridge that gap. Obviously, a bridge requires a very strong foundation, and that comes from across the whole board. So incentivize and really just make these things supportive of all these initiatives, and small businesses that are trying to harness waste as a resource, and a circular sort of adopting the circular, encouraging the circular sort of mindset in our products, and how we deal with everything that we're generating is what I would say off of firsthand.
Malak, do you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad question. I think it's one of the issues that we still address when we talk about not only environmental issues, but general social, economic, and even political issues in many countries around the region, is that how this gap can be bridged. But as Alicia said, governments must provide the opportunity, or even the incentive, in a sense, for citizens to be part of this, I would say, decision-making process, because decision-making process is connected with citizens. And although we have seen, for instance, social initiatives, civic society, and so on, that has been increasing in the region, but the gap is still widening more and more between governments and many civic-led initiatives and associations within the region. So I believe that the government takes a role in this aspect, and they must open or provide an opportunity to have a communication in order to include different stakeholders within the society. We're talking about the private sector, we're talking about educational institutions, we're talking about civic society. So I can't say that both of them should open, because citizens are somewhat open to that communication, but governments mostly in the region are blocking that connection path. So I believe that there should be more, it should be more from the governmental aspect to open or provide accessibility for citizens to be part of this open discussion on environmental issues specifically.
Yep, that's a great point. All right, our last few minutes, I'll just rapid fire through some of these Q&A questions. So I'll read them and pose them and synthesize them, and then any and all of you are free to answer. So I'll start with a question from Jamima, who's actually a colleague of ours. It's good to see this question. So she asked, dear panel, how do you think that the desire for sustained or increased government, so this kind of ties in with where we left off, will impact citizen scrutiny and responses to transboundary water agreements and financing of major water infrastructure? Use examples of the National Water Conveyance in Jordan and 16 new desal plants in Egypt, etc. So I guess the question is, how do you think the desire for increased government sort of action will impact citizens' sort of attention and scrutiny on these water transboundary type solutions issues? Or is there? I mean, any thoughts?
I mean, it's a good question, and I think from this sort of survey, it would require a little bit more detail, because this comes back to does everybody understand the bigger picture, and are they prepared to realize that our water resources are shared essentially, and there's a huge responsibility when we're talking about the transboundary of water, that there's a lot of stakeholders involved. And I don't know if the citizens are prepared to face that, because it's overwhelming once you start realizing that, it's not just that these problems are localized, but they can also, be a much bigger problem outside of their capabilities to manage. I think that they're still getting their head around their problems that they face on a local level. So addressing a transboundary might be a little bit more than they would be willing to address right now. But it's a really good question, and I could elaborate on it more if I think about it. But thanks for that question.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask. I think this is another follow-up interesting question, which is, overall, what are your key takeaways on the link between climate change policy and action and young people or different generations of people in the region? Do you see a particular trend or link in terms of interest, engagement with climate change policy, and then sort of different stratifications of age groups? And not to be too on the nose on this, but maybe Malak, I'll ask you as potentially our resident younger person, maybe if your perspective on this. And I say that with respect, of course.
I mean, if we're addressing young people or their linkage to the climate change policy and action, I think in the region, when we talk about young people, especially young climate activists or youth climate activists within the region, the activism, in a sense, although it's there, but it's still a bit scattered and I would say not supported enough. In terms of climate action, indeed, there is a link between climate action in the region and the young generation, but I'm not sure to what extent governments, they take the young generation perspective as climate action drivers to adopt certain climate change policies, for instance. So I wouldn't say it's highly linked, but I think the question around young or youth activists in the region within the climate change sphere is still a huge question. And especially now we're addressing COP27, we're talking about youth-led climate initiatives, their presence in Egypt, and to what extent they will be there, and what kind of initiatives that are going to boycott COP this year, and so on. So climate action is directly linked to youth in the region, and I would say they are the drivers for so many climate action, and they do their best to pressure certain governments, but at the same time, do really governments support their climate policies to the younger generation? So this is my take on this one.
Hamid, if I can add one thing from the survey, what we've seen is that one of the things that you would expect from a battery of questions like this is that you would expect to see a huge difference between youth and those who are older, but that was not the case in our survey. We didn't really see that big of a difference across like the environmental questions. We didn't see that big difference in terms of wanting the government to do more action, to take more action, or in terms of recycling, or even the other questions. What we've seen in a few cases, in a few questions, that those who are 60 or older are a bit less, I don't want to say interested, but they're less likely or less inclined to kind of support or express awareness of environmental challenges, but it's not really, we didn't see as strong an age story as we expected from the survey.
That is interesting. I think there's a common perception or maybe misconception that, obviously we've seen it in terms of youth driving sort of the climate agenda in terms of seeking action, and the perception is that older generation, maybe not necessarily older generations, but those that are entrenched in institutions that are related to climate change are resistant to shifting the status quo. I think there's still some truth to that, but to your point, the stratification isn't as maybe as stark as people think, isn't as big as people think. Okay, let me maybe ask one question that was technical, which is related to the survey, Mohammed, in terms of the issue of water, needing to be front and center of the climate change piece or the climate question, noting that water scarcity, should water scarcity be the key phrase that might trigger, response as a leading question, or, this is just more of a sort of, I guess, a technical comment on, as you improve and adjust your survey subsequent waves. What's your perspective on that?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, we didn't use the term scarcity. We put the different options like pollution of drinking water, lack of water resources, I think that's that. Well, I mean, this is what we've seen from the survey, that there's. I think if we just put water scarcity, we might lose some nuance there. So I think having the options the way we had them originally kind of allowed us to see the big differences that we've seen across countries in terms of water related issues. Again, like our questionnaire is online in both Arabic and English, so people could see the actual language that we used in our countries.
Great. Sort of a question and yes, Elisa.
I didn't want to interrupt you on the last question, but I just wanted to kind of put it out there, because when we talk about the younger generation and activism, what is the next step? And that is the competency. And are they prepared to, get those green skill sets to actually address these problems? And activism is great. It's important to be out there and to speak what we believe, but we're going to need those skills to actually address these matters. So when we talk about the youth, we really, the older generations are there to say, in my time, this was that, and the water was pure, and this was amazing. And I think that's where the younger generations are adopting, and now they want to stand up for that, because they realize that at one point in time, their great grandmother lived in an environment where the air quality was good, the water quality was there, it was abundant. And now that we face, our abundance of water is limited, and the quality of the environment might not be what it is, they're acting out, they're speaking about it, which is great, but we really have to kind of build them up to get those skills to cover what we need to address.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's something I tend to harp on as well, which is it's an evolution, right, of response, right? And we're in a state right now where climate activism is very important to push the agenda, to get to the policies and initiatives that we need to address the climate crisis. But you're absolutely right. We also need to be cognizant that hopefully we are successful in pushing, positive change forward. But there comes a point where, okay, once climate is now is truly the driver, the climate response is now a key issue and people are focused on it. It's the main meal. We need people from a technical perspective, or have the skill set and background to now implement these types of solutions, because resolving some of these issues require technical solutions, right? Implementation of projects, activities, etc. We need people that have that skill set. So I always, maybe in a biased way, I'm always pushing STEM. STEM fields are always going to be important. Climate activism is great, but there comes, in an ideal future, we may reach a point where, yes, everyone's on board to addressing climate. Who's going to do it? We need those people ready as well. So I think we can stop there. I apologize if I didn't get to your questions in the Q&A. I didn't get to all of my questions. So I think there was just a lot to talk about here. But panelists, do you have any final thoughts, Mohammed, in terms of sort of the process and experience, and we can conclude there?
I would just invite everyone to look at the data that we have online. Again, we have all the data from all countries already published on our website. We have the technical report, we have the questionnaire, and we have some reports and commentary. And we would love to see any contributions in terms of analysis. on the data that we have, especially on the environment, but also on any other topic that we cover in the surveys as well.
Great. Thank you also very much, Mohammed, Malak, Alicia. Great discussion, great presentation. This obviously doesn't end here. It's an ongoing topic and issue. So thank you also very much, and thank you for our audience for participating as well.